Hello, and welcome to the second in a series of masterclasses that focus on governance in the context of AI. My name is Tim Tyler, and I'm hosting today's event. It is, of course, early stages, and there are one or two people still arriving, so we will allow just a few more seconds before we start in earnest. Okay. I think that's long enough. Let's make a start. This, of course, is, as I said, the second in a series of masterclasses. The first was on the 9th of December last year, and it's available on the Zango website. For those that joined us, you'll remember a lively and engaging webinar that focused on prompt engineering. It included reference to red and safe zones, model limitations, chain prompting. It included a live exercise and reference to something that was new to me, which was temperature settings that Ashi introduced us to. Today's focus, though, is on evaluation and human engagement. We're going to begin in a moment, but before we do, one or two practicalities. Firstly, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat function for any questions that you may have. And we've made provision for responding to questions at three separate points over the next hour. We can't guarantee we'll get to all of them, but we will try and consider them at the first opportunity on one of those 3 points. The second thing to say is that as there was for the first masterclass, there will be some polling taking place. We're very keen to hear your views and your thoughts and to interact with that and include it within the substance of what we're talking about today. I think now there would be a good time for one or two introductions. You'll know those that joined for the first webinar. You'll know Sam and Ashi, but possibly not Daniel. So Daniel, can I start with yourself? If you'd like to just say a few words by way of introduction.
Yep, my name's Daniel Chatfield. I've worked at Monzo Bank for just over 10 years, and for the last 2 years, I've been working in the European expansion team.
Good to have you with us. Thank you for joining, Daniel. Sam, over to you.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone. Great to see so many of you today. So I'm Sam Green. I lead Zango's policy and partnerships work. So at Zango, we are the AI compliance layer for financial services. Essentially, we build AI agents for risk and compliance, such as for regulatory change management, horizon scanning, policy gap analysis, controls testing, and so on. So we're going to be talking today around using general purpose AI tools, but a lot of the insights that we're sharing come from our experience deploying specialized AI solutions in financial services. My background is in the UK government, so I've formerly headed up the supervision and compliance team in the AI regulation unit. But it's great to see you all and looking forward to this session.
Thanks, Sam. Ashi.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Great to see so many of you here. My name is Ashi, and my role at Zango is a regulatory AI architect. And what that means is, like Sam mentioned, I work very closely with the AI engineers in our team to help build some of those AI compliance agents that Sam mentioned. And a big part of my role is also looking after the QA team. So making sure that all AI outputs are accurate before they go to the end user. And before this, I was in KPMG risk consulting all the way over in New Zealand. And I've been at Zango for about a year now and loving the change.
Thank you, Ashi. And I'm Tim Tyler. I'm the Vice President of the International Compliance Association, and the ICA is supporting Zango. I think we could say that is supporting Zango in this fantastic project. But I've been given permission to say just a few things to set the scene before we launch into the substance of today's masterclass. So I'll try and keep this very brief, but there are, I think, one or two things that would usefully remind ourselves of. And I think we start by recognizing that there are several things that we can say about AI with absolute confidence. Firstly, it is powerful and transformative. I hardly need to dwell on that. But secondly, and going further, it's already redefining the workplace. It raises new challenges, including, for instance, cognitive atrophy, the future role of humans in the workplace, questions around what accountability actually means, what it looks like to the future. But there's a third thing I think we can say about AI, and that is that we don't really know what the future looks like. We can see some drivers. So, drivers for change include now the emerging ability for AI to self-code with exponential potential that this creates. We're seeing, of course, enabling technologies like quantum computing, decentralized ledgers, biometrics, nanotechnology. We recognize the speed of change, which is unprecedented, and the kinetic environment that we currently see this development within that enables future change delivered by markets and governments. So, with all this in mind, it's reasonable to expect that AI will evolve way beyond what we're seeing at the moment. We don't really know what this looks like, and perhaps we can't know with any confidence, but we can say that the risks are non-trivial. I was listening yesterday to a lecture by Sir Ken Robinson. He was talking at the time about education, but he quoted from Abraham Lincoln. You probably weren't expecting this, but let me just make reference to that quote because I think it's very relevant to today's discussion. Abraham Lincoln said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew." And as I say, I wonder whether this is more relevant and urgent today than even when those words were spoken. We must think anew because we're surrounded by unprecedented change. We have a long established risk management paradigm. We have the framework, the means to measure, to mitigate the risks that we can identify. And that's been developed over many, many years. And it has formed the basis for fantastic growth and development across the world. And it's a paradigm that we can understand, define, anticipate, and measure. But AI is changing the landscape. It presents unprecedented risks at every level that aren't fully understood. And with that, it demands different ways to measure the impact. And this is the exciting thing. As governance professionals, we have the opportunity and I think the obligation to embrace this change and the uncertainty that it brings and how we make sense of the challenges, how we measure risk and performance, and how we manage the risks that this presents. So all of that said, I think this is one of the reasons why I'm so excited to be part of this conversation today, recognizing the work that Zango is doing as so important as we are grappling with, wrestling with the challenges that AI presents, figuring out how we effectively manage them and develop a foundation to future successful use of the technology. Okay, I need to get out of the way now. I was given the opportunity to say a few words, and I hope that makes some sense. But I think we're going to share some slides now, and we've got the opportunity to very briefly reflect on what we're going to cover today and to recognize what we build this upon. The previous workshop in December, which I touched on a few moments ago, considered all of the things that you can see here. I was fascinated by this workshop. I found it very, very practical, very hands-on, very useful, covering the areas that I've touched on and we can see in this slide. And I know today's workshop, we're going to build on that in these areas that you can see set out here. I won't go through them in detail. We are going to consider across all of these areas, initially with Sam. Sam is going to hand on to Ashi. Ashi is going to explore some of the issues before Daniel offers us a case study. And I think Sam then will wrap up. For the moment, though, I'm going to hand on to Sam.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tim, for that thoughtful introduction. So as Tim mentioned, we ran a previous masterclass, and in that masterclass, we ran a poll, and it indicated that lack of trust in AI outputs is the biggest barrier to using AI confidently in organizations. So this is essentially a confidence gap. And today we're going to walk you through practical techniques that teach you how to evaluate AI and build that confidence. So first, if we look at why existing QA functions aren't effective for large language models. So QA stands for quality assurance. That's essentially the process of evaluating workflows and outputs to check that everything is in order. Now, existing QA approaches simply don't work for large language models. And that's because AI doesn't know what the correct answer is in the same way that a calculator does. That's because LLMs are probabilistic systems. So they choose answers based on what's most likely to make sense based on probabilities. And consequently, their outputs are not always predictable. Many of you will have seen that when you use ChatGPT, occasionally it will ask, which of these two responses do you prefer? And that's exactly what's happening here. Now, this breaks traditional QA approaches that assume that there is a repeatable output where there's one clear, correct answer. So we're going to kick off with a poll now. So how often do you come across work that is clearly AI produced and error ridden? So is it constantly? Is it frequently? Occasionally? Rarely? Or not at all? And I, of course, wouldn't want to bias the results, but obviously a key issue here is that sometimes AI errors are obvious, sometimes they're clearly wrong, other times they're much more subtle. And that's dangerous, especially when it comes to compliance. Amazing. So lots of answers coming in. Lots of answers coming in. And I'll share that now. So it's looking like exactly as suspected. It's quite often that that we come across work that is AI produced and it's error ridden. So I think that really shows that there is a real importance in terms of understanding how to challenge those AI outputs and how to make sure that they're human validated. So I'm going to pass straight on to Ashi, who's going to walk you through that.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Sam. So I'm sure everyone's already using AI in their roles, and we know that the models are getting a lot better. It feels like, ChatGPT, OpenAI, or Gemini is putting out a new update every single week, so there's progress. But when we speak to risk and compliance teams, there's still a lot of concerns around inaccuracies, hallucinations. We can't trust the output. And these are all super valid because it's really hard to use AI reliably beyond, your low risk, but to an extent low value tasks like research, drafting emails, internal stuff, etc. So a lot of substantive tasks are still super manual. So in this workshop, what we want to do is go over why AI models fail, how you can overcome some of these inaccuracies, and also how can you evaluate AI outputs more effectively. And hopefully you leave the session feeling a bit more confident about using AI as an accelerator. So let's start off with the context problem. So there's a lot of technical reasons why AI outputs get it wrong, and I won't go into all of them, but the context problem is an interesting way to frame it. So everyone's probably already heard that the more context you give AI, the better it performs, and that is directionally true, but there's a bit more to it than that. So AI models have what we call a context window, which is the maximum amount of text that it can process at a time. And that's measured in tokens and not words. And this window includes a ton of data. So what your initial instructions were, any files that you upload, and basically your entire conversation history, including the model's own sometimes very lengthy responses. And things tend to go wrong when this context window starts to run out. And we see this happen all the time in long conversations. So, for example, you ask ChatGPT a super pointed question, and the answer is usually quite good. But then when you add a ton of more information, maybe you change the direction a little bit, you upload a file, things start to get quite poor. So what's basically happening is that context window starts to get really strained, and these older messages tend to get forgotten, and that's when inaccuracies start to pop up. And completeness tends to get really poor. So a quick hack for this that I found really helpful is this, which is when you're in a super long conversation, lots of different directions have been thrown around, you can paste this into your model. And the prompt is, if you had to complete this task perfectly using a single well-structured prompt, what would that prompt be? Rewrite my request, and identify objective, audience, scope, etc. So basically, using this is going to give you a really curated single prompt, which consolidates all of your conversation really nicely, and you can paste that in a new chat and expect much better results. And in fact, I recommend that every time you start a new conversation on a new topic, start a fresh chat. You want to start on a fresh context window. Perfect. And the other time this happens is when you go through really long documents. So if you upload a 100-page regulation, for example, what ends up happening is that every paragraph is sort of competing for the model's attention, and it starts to skim read the whole thing. And then it drops information when it's skim reading. And AI is terrible at understanding materiality, so sometimes the information it drops is pretty material. And what it does is it starts to fill in the gaps with invented details that sound plausible, but aren't actually grounded in fact. And that's what creates hallucinations, which I think a lot of us see happen very often. And the way to mitigate this risk is what we call document chunking. And we covered this in our previous masterclass, but I'm just going to very quickly go through it again. Basically, what it means is breaking up your document using a PDF editor into smaller chunks and processing each chunk one at a time using the same instructions. And you'll see that the accuracy starts to get a lot better. And the last one that we see is that poor context at the outset also tends to give rise to a few inaccuracies because there's not enough context to ground the answers. And how we solve for that is by giving the model a really comprehensive context injection at the start of your task prompt. Now, you don't really need to do this for something super simple, like when you're asking, when's the next Olympics or what year was Madonna born? But, when you're doing something a bit more substantive, and you're going to be uploading a lot of data and you want to set the context firmly at the start. So this means telling the model who it is, like what role is it performing, what kind of world is it operating in, any jurisdictions, what kind of phone type it's for, who the audience is, but also what are the sort of key priorities or constraints that it needs to keep in mind. And we'll put this in practice very shortly, and any prompts that we cover in the session will also send across as part of the post-workshop resources. So perfect. I think we've done quite a few pieces of theory. So we'll do a quick questions break. Tim, are we seeing any questions coming through? Please post them on the chat if you have any, and we'll do our best to go through them.
We have two questions, but can I say before we come to them that the way that you're describing this is recognizing that we've got something incredibly, staggeringly powerful and arguably intelligent, and yet we need to treat it in a quite childlike way with simple instructions and spoon-feeding content. In some ways, it's quite difficult for us to relate and bring those two together. However, more importantly, Connor, thank you for your question. You ask, is there any way of knowing when we've run out of context capacity?
Yes. So I think some interfaces like Google AI Studio, when you upload a document, it'll sort of show you like how many tokens that document is consuming compared to how many tokens are available for you. But a lot of them don't actually tell you this. For example, ChatGPT or Perplexity won't tell you this data.
So I noticed when you were using Google AI, I think in the last workshop, that there was more calibration around this. So different applications give you different feedback, and a natural question, which I'm sure people will be asking, is, well, what's the best one to use? And it probably isn't as binary as that, as she.
Yeah, so Google Gemini actually has a longer context window than OpenAI models do. So that's why for pointier questions, ChatGPT is great. But when you're uploading data or uploading documents, I would prefer to use Google AI Studio or Gemini. It does have a longer context window. And also, so our AI engineer has actually recently done a blog on context engineering, which is super, super detailed and really helpful if anyone wants to read that on our website. But also, it's not always about like the context window running out. So it's not like it's perfect until it runs out. It's more about the more data you put, the more that context window starts to get strained. So the loss of accuracy is sort of like it's not linear, it's gradual.
Zara asks, when it comes to chunking documents, how do you ensure that the AI capability interprets the chunks in conjunction with each other? Thinking a document with defined terms at the start, for instance.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. And it's particularly important when we're dealing with regulation, because, for example, like Section 5 might cross-reference Section 83, and it's in different chunks. So you don't want to sort of lose that context. And I'll be honest, it's really hard to do using general purpose models. Really hard to solve for that. What we do is we sort of, extract definitions separately and then feed them into the entire data. And then wherever cross-references are, we also sort of have mapping for those so that we don't lose that cross-referencing and definitions. But yeah, no, it's something that I personally don't know how to overcome with general purpose models.
Abby asks a question which I'm going to be honest, I don't fully understand, but I suspect that Ashi, you will. So Abby asks, does the use of GPTs or projects with set instructions improve the context capacity, or is it the same as listing out the prompt in full each time?
So would you mind just repeating the
Yeah, of course. We might need to go back to Abby to clarify the question, but she asks, does the use of GPTs or projects with set instructions improve the context capacity, or is it the same as listing out the prompt in full each time?
Right, no, I would actually include the context as part of the full prompt rather than passing them in different prompts, because you want your context to be closely tied to the tasks and instructions. So passing it separately actually isn't that helpful.
And I think it's worth saying that it doesn't increase the model's kind of technical context window. That is the same. That is kind of fixed.
Okay, one more question and then we'll carry on, shall we? Zara, if you create an agent in Copilot, does the context you give the agent use up the context window?
Yes.
It
So
does.
any data you feed into the model will use up the context window to an extent.
Okay. Well, there's going to be opportunity to respond to further questions. So keep them coming. But for the moment, I'm going to hand back to Ashi.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tim. And if there's anything that we don't cover in the session, feel free to email myself or Sam, and we'll do our best to get back to you over email as well. So if we move on to the next piece. So we've gone through some quick prompting techniques, and unfortunately, if these could, solve all of our hallucination issues, my QA team could go on holiday, and everyone would adopt AI at 100 times speed, but we're not quite there yet. So that's where evaluation techniques come in. And what we're going to do today, and this might be a little bit controversial, is using AI to evaluate AI outputs to accelerate our decision making, because no one really has time to do sort of a line-by-line review of AI outputs. Perfect. So I'm going to run through these two key techniques that we're going to use today, and we'll very quickly show you how we can put them in practice. The first one is LLM as a judge, which means giving the AI your output to review, and then also giving it a very explicit scoring criteria to review that output against. And the next one we're going to cover is confidence scoring, which is super helpful when you've done any form of like mapping or matching. For example, if you've mapped regulatory obligations to internal policies, or you've mapped, controls to requirements, you can use confidence scoring to identify where the AI has done sort of a bit of a weak match, and you can filter out what needs a closer review. So we've learned some prompting techniques. We are going to put this in practice and review this obligation register now. So just bear with me as I reshare my screen. Okay, perfect. So this is Zango's platform, and what we have here is a centralized law library where I have a repository of all of my regulations, laws, guidance, etc. And today we are working with this section of the FCA handbook, which is DIS 1, treating customers fairly. And what we've done is extracted all of the obligations from this regulatory source. So when I say obligations, I mean any instructions, guidance, rules, recommendations that the regulation contains. And I've also been able to filter this very quickly by which obligations apply to the firm. And for this context, let's say we're working with a UK retail bank. So these obligations are extracted using AI. If you go back to our first workshop, you can access the recording and the resources on our website. We actually teach you how you can use general purpose models to extract these obligations in the first go with about 80% accuracy. So we highly recommend checking that out. But before we go, these obligations come on the platform, we would do a number of checks to make sure that these are accurate. And one of the checks that we're going to walk you through today is the completeness check, which is, for example, if the obligation is that, if a customer makes a complaint, you need to respond to them in 2 days. How do we make sure that the model hasn't reduced that down to, if a customer makes a complaint, respond to them in a timely manner? So we want to catch any sort of completeness issues or granularity loss that might have happened as we've extracted them using AI. So very quickly, the first thing I want to cover is that this is a 74-page document, and I can't upload this in one shot. It's going to give me terrible results. So I've actually chunked this into a 19-page set for my first chunk. And that's what we're going to be working with today. So I've exported these out to this Excel sheet over here, which you can see. And some of the data that we're capturing is the section name, obligation title, obligation description.
And so just to clarify, Ashley, so this is obligations that have been extracted, and in our previous workshop, we kind of show you how to use general purpose tools to create something like this. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And we teach you how to do that chunking as well. Perfect. And we are going to use Google AI Studio to review these today. So for those of you that are not familiar with Google AI Studio, it's quite simple to use and it's free to use. It looks complex, but you can just type in Google AI Studio and this will come up. And it's the same as Gemini, but this interface just lets me play with the underlying settings a bit. And the key setting that I play with is this temperature setting. So what this controls is how predictable or creative the AI outputs will be. So 0 is super, super grounded and predictable, 2 is super creative, and 0.6 is a really nice balance between the two. Perfect. So let's do our first completeness check. We are going to upload some resources here. So I'm going to upload set A, which was 19 pages of the FCA handbook on customer complaints, and also set A of my obligations. And I am going to paste this prompt in. And while that's running, let's very quickly talk through the prompt that we've used today. And again, these will be available after the masterclass as well. So the first things first, it's the context injection. We're telling it what's the role. It's a senior regulatory compliance auditor reviewing my obligation register for completeness. We're telling it the industry it's operating in, regulated financial services, jurisdiction is UK, the firm type is a retail bank, and I'm also listing the priorities and constraints. I'm setting out the task of what it needs to do, which is compare my regulatory text to my obligations and identify anything that might be incomplete or non-granular. And I'm also setting out a completeness criteria, which is that LLM as a judge element. So I'm saying, if the regulation is, listing 8 things that I need to do, let's make sure that the model isn't collapsing that into one generic thing. If the obligation only applies to like a particular role, for example, the management body, let's retain that actor. If there are any conditions or thresholds, we want to retain those. Any procedural strips of this is what you need to do, but this is how you need to do it, I want to retain that information, and any qualifiers or standards. I also set out the results that I want, and I define them. So an obligation that's complete means that it's very close to the source, there's no missing elements. If it needs refinement, it means that maybe there's been some data loss. And if it's invalid, something's gone very wrong and it's completely hallucinated. And also I set out the output structure. So I want it in a table format, and these are the fields that I want. So having a comprehensive prompt is actually really important for getting consistent outputs. So getting it right at the first go, it's worth spending time on your prompt. And as our AI engineers will definitely confirm. So if we go back over here, we can see that we've got some results come through. Let's look at how our obligations have fared. So just bear with me as I get these.
And so here, essentially, the AI has made an assessment as to, how complete that particular output is.
Exactly. And it looks like most things are complete. There's nothing completely invalid, which is a good sign. But I can see some of these are flagged as needing refinement. So Okay, let's have a look over here. So this obligation, for example, says that, once a MiFID complaint has been received by the firm needs to investigate this complaint and obtain additional information that it needs. And we're saying that the source actually has like a 3-step process it needs to follow. So it needs to investigate complaints, assess them, and then comply to them. And the obligation is sort of oversimplified it into a single step. So you can see where I'm going with this. You can use AI to identify the 20% of cases that need a closer review. And then once you get this output, you know where the obligation is coming from. You can very quickly go back to the source text, review the obligation, update any wording that needs to be updated, and then it's fit for use for any sort of downstream use cases. So an obligation set is usually really important for other purposes. For example, policy gap analysis. So spending time and getting this right is important. Any couple questions on this before I move ahead to the next use case?
There are, and Emmanuel and Daniel ask a similar question, which is around the temperature settings and other related settings on Google AI Studio. Daniel observes that the playground, his word, the playground in the sidebar on the right, it can be hidden.
Yes.
And how do you then access that? Can you show us,
Yeah.
perhaps?
No, that's a very fair point. Sometimes this can be hidden. So if I go to Google AI Studio, I think this is actually a recent change that has come up. If I go to Home, then the playground is hidden. So what I need to go is I need to click on Gemini 3 Flash, and then it pops up.
Got it. Thank you. And hopefully, Emmanuel, Daniel, that answers your question. Another one linked to this, Connor asks about temperature setting again, and what use cases are for both ends of the sliding scale. So I think, I guess is what he's asking is, when might you use the most imaginative, creative, and when might you use the strictest?
No, that makes sense. So the default is 1. So if you go to ChatGPT or Google Gemini, you're going to have 1. And you want your answer to be a little bit more creative. For example, when you're editing your email, you don't want to send in like a terrible email and then say, please clean this up, and it comes back and there's been like very minor changes made. In that case, you sort of want the AI to sort of drastically change the output. So anything where there's like room for a little bit of creativity and tonal changes. Perhaps you're writing an opinion piece, perhaps you're writing, if you write poetry or fiction, short fiction, it's worth going more creative. And then where you want it to be extremely sort of on the lower end of the scale, I'd say perhaps when you're wanting to find like specific regulatory references, like where does this belong? Or
it's a little bit like a risk-based approach then. You sort of
like
need to be aware of that there are elements of risk with the higher levels of creativity, but depending on your user requirement, you can manage those. Okay. I think we're on top of the questions. So I think at this point we move to Daniel.
Oh no, sorry.
No, we're back to you, Ashi. I'm so sorry. Back to you.
No, you're good. I have one more bit to go over, but I'll do it very quickly because we want to hear from Daniel. So the next use case is I've got my obligation register. What I want to do next is compare it to my policy and see where are my gaps and where do I need to maybe uplift my policy to meet the regulation. So we've done that over here. Again, we've generated this using AI, and maybe in a potential future workshop, we'll go over how you can do a policy gap analysis using AI. But what I've got here is my original obligation, but then also what policy section does it map to, and what the reference is. And precisely what's the evidence from the policy that aligns to my obligation from the regulation. And also what the outcome is. So either it's adequately covered, partially covered, or a complete gap in my policy. But the next thing we want to do is very quickly review how good these matches are. So, for example, where it's adequate, is it actually adequate, or the AI sort of, doing a bit of a logic leap and connecting sections that don't match that well? So we're going to use confidence scoring for that. Perfect. So I'm going to start a new AI chat and upload my documents. So I've got the complaints policy over here that I'm looking at, and also my obligations that I'm reviewing. Oops, something's happened here. I put in this format. And this is the prompt that I'm going to be using today. Perfect. While this is running, let's very quickly go through the prompts that we're going to be using today. So the context is largely very similar. The only thing I've changed is the priorities and constraints. So I'm saying make sure that you require explicit coverage of the policy. Don't just sort of assume that things are aligning. And also where your legislative wording is ambiguous or incomplete, let's flag that. Don't sort of interpret intent where it doesn't exist. We've got the task. So it needs to look at, is to make sure that the policy is covering all of the obligation's key details. And it also needs to consider strength, whether that strength is low, medium, or high for the match between the policy and my obligation. And once again, I'm defining exactly what my results need to be, whether it's a high match, a medium match, which probably indicates partial coverage, or a low match, where I would probably expect there to be a gap. Once again, I am asking the table output to be returned in a very specific format. So let's see whether, oh no, let's not go to this one. Perfect, so we've got some results coming in now. So I'm going to paste these over here. Oh. So what you'll notice is I've also extracted a rationale, and I really recommend doing that because forcing the model to give you a reason for its assessment actually makes it perform a lot better because it slows down. And yeah, that's important. So let's look at our low matches first. And all of these are where we're saying there's a gap in our policy, so that makes sense. No issues there. Let's look at our high matches. I would expect all of these to be adequate, and that's right. And let's maybe look at our mediums. Okay, so mostly they're looking about right. I would expect a medium confidence match to be a partial. We've got one over here. So the obligation is saying that investment firms need to publish the details of the process when handling a MiFID complaint. And this needs to include information about the complaints management policy and the contact details of the complaints management team. And the policy is saying, when making a complaint in a written format, customers are reminded, and that's all it says. So the reason this is a medium match is because the policy doesn't actually explicitly state the publication of the policy, and it doesn't actually include the contact details as a binding regulatory requirement. So that is one way you can identify where that sort of weak matching is. And once again, what are the sort of exception cases where you need to go back to the policy and do a manual review? Perfect. So that is my section all done. And hopefully you feel a bit more confident about evaluating AI outputs.
Thank you, Ashley. Could you, before we move on to Daniel, could you just briefly summarize what you've just done in front of us? just to sort of put a underline beneath it?
Yes, absolutely. So I'd extracted my obligations from the FCA handbook on customer complaints. Next, what I had done is I had mapped them to my complaints policy, where I had an output of whether my obligation was, partially met, adequately met, or a gap, and where the AI model identified some form of a match against my policy, I wanted to make sure that that match was actually right. It wasn't just sort of linking garbage information together. I wanted to make sure, does my policy actually meet this requirement, or is AI making stuff up? So I've done a confidence scoring of those matches to help sort of confirm my initial assessment. So where it's a high confidence score, I know that my output is right. But where it's a medium or low confidence score, we know that it needs a closer look.
Ashley, thank you. And of course, this is exactly the sort of thing that firms all around the UK and to an extent around the world will need to be doing. It's a really relevant and practical example. Thank you.
I'm conscious of time, so maybe we'll quickly go to Daniel now, and I will stop sharing my screen. And Daniel, if you want to start sharing your screen, perfect.
Hi, so I'm going to quickly talk about how we use some of these things at Monzo. Before I do that, just some background context. So in December last year, we received our European banking license in Ireland and started onboarding customers approximately 1 week later. Obviously, that's a huge milestone for us, but sort of behind the scenes, lots of work happened before that in order to sort of get the bank ready to launch in Ireland. And we put a lot of focus on how we efficiently identify and understand local compliance requirements. So we effectively have built a large UK bank, but now with our ambitions to sort of take that across Europe, there are a large number of local requirements that differ in those different markets. There's a lot of European harmonization, but there's still a lot of local nuances to the compliance requirements. So if we are trying to launch, say, instant access savings in Ireland, we want to quickly identify that sort of delta, like what's the things that we need to change in that product so that it works for that market. And there are a few different approaches that you can take to sort of doing this. One approach, which doesn't work very well, is you sort of have the product teams go away and design and sort of build the product, and then you do a compliance review at the end of the process. And this doesn't tend to work very well because you then tend to need to rebuild the product because you realize that you didn't know about any of the things that you needed to do. So we don't try and do that. The other approach, which has been sort of more typical, is try and upfront identify all of the requirements and produce sort of a set of product requirements that then can be input into the design and build of the product. That works, but it has a couple of downsides. So one is it takes time to go through all of the rules, regulations, and guidance documents to sort of produce that input for design and product. And that creates this sort of period of waiting where the product teams can't get started yet because they don't have that input. And this sort of waterfall style approach to project management results in sort of longer, slower projects rather than more agile processes. The other downside is what we like to call the requirement myth. So to use an example, if we imagine that a piece of legislation in Ireland has this requirement, anywhere that AER is displayed, it must also display the expanded acronym. That's pretty straightforward. So that's likely to end up in a requirements doc just as the same thing. And there's sort of no loss of meaning there. So that's all good. But lots of legislation, and especially these days, and it's sort of moving more and more in that direction, is more sort of risk-based or principles-based or outcome-driven. So something like the institution should ensure they have adequately validated the identity commensurate with the risk posed. There are lots of different ways you can interpret that in terms of actually how should the product work. And if you try and just front load all of your sort of requirements from legislation to come up into clear requirements for a product team, that risks being mistranslated and being turned into something like, we need to require the applicant to upload proof of address. And that can sort of go around as the law requires us to do X, where actually the law was more vague and there was more room for interpretation than has then been sort of conveyed. And that typically results in sort of a product that is sort of overly risk averse, where the law has been intentionally written in a way that allows for some interpretation, and sort of the strictest possible interpretation is sort of often ends up in a requirements doc. So the way that we've been approaching this, and it's been working quite well for us, is to heavily leverage AI for that sort of first pass, not expecting that to give us a perfect understanding of all the requirements, but actually significantly speeds up the time it takes to get to sort of an 80% understanding of the requirements that are needed. That then unblocks design and engineering to start building that product. And as they're doing that, they're sort of engaging with compliance and partnering on what are the areas where there's the most ambiguity, where the requirement has the most scope for interpretation, and that actually it might have the most implications on how the product works, and really working together to come up with that right balance and partnering on that interpretation piece. This means that we can stay productive all of the time. We're not engineers waiting to hear back on answers to compliance questions, but we're still not just taking that AI output and treating that as sort of the final result. We're using that as sort of the initial input, and then still doing a like full rules mapping and carefully going through to make sure we've got full coverage. So I'll do a quick demo, conscious of time, so I'll make this very quick. So I prepared a prompt earlier. So I'll just kick this off and then I'll explain the prompt while it's working. So giving it like, it's quite intelligent, but it starts with no knowledge every time. So sort of giving it the knowledge. I work for Monzo, a UK bank that is looking to expand into Ireland, and I'm looking at what work we need to do to uplift our instant access savings product so it can be launched in Ireland. Tell it what I want, like summarize the laws and regulations that apply. These are the sort of things that I want you to look into. What are the onboarding requirements? Is there information we need to collect from the customer beyond what would be sort of standard for a current account? Are there any requirements on how interest is paid on the savings account? What are the tax implications there? It then comes back with a really nice summary. So it mentions the laws. This is very useful for forming a basis of a sort of a rules mapping exercise later. It gives you sort of the main differences. So we can immediately now start investigating what do we need to do to collect the PPSN from customers and looking into that. It talks about the interest taxation and what exemptions might exist from that, which again immediately starts identifying sort of work streams that need to exist, and that we don't have that in the UK. We don't withhold tax from interest at source, and we don't have exemption processes. So that would be very novel for us. So this doesn't give you all of the detail, but it gives you a pretty good high level sort of map of where to now drill into and where you can kick off more work. So if you're sort of an engineering team working on this, you're immediately thinking through, I need to be building an exemptions flow and stuff like that. And you don't have all of the detail yet, but you're sort of immediately aware that that's something that we need to start doing. You can then, if you want the input in a slightly different format, you can ask it to do things like create me a product requirements doc. While it's doing that, I'll quickly move over to the Notebook LM. So Notebook LM is really, really good. I'll quickly summarize what it is and then give you like a quick example. So it lets you create your sort of own mini AI where you've controlled sort of the sources that it's using. And that can be a mix of sources from the internet, but also internal sources. So the best way of doing it is you just sort of put a search term in, it goes and finds a bunch of sources, and then you can sort of vet them and then just include them and build up sort of a knowledge base. I really like being able to include the internal context. So if you've internally discussed your approach to how you want to comply with a certain thing, you can just upload that document there, and then it suddenly sort of learned that context and can answer questions quickly. The real power of the Notebook LM is it lets people ask questions and get good quality answers. Not perfect. It's not a substitute for asking a compliance professional, but get good quality answers very, very quickly. So if a team is looking at implementing the sort of interest system for withholding tax in Ireland, and they've got a question on how to do that, they can ask the Notebook LM, get a provisional answer, which they'll still sense check with a human later, but it means that they don't have to wait for a human response, which might take hours or in some cases a couple of days because people are busy and they're in meetings. They can get a provisional answer that 90% of the time is correct, assume that it's correct, double check it later, and only 10% of the time do they need to sort of refine their approach. So if I go back to the Gemini, so it can nicely sort of summarize the requirements. It's given me a different response as it did last week. So last week when I asked it to do this, it hallucinated something. It's got better. It stopped doing that. But I was going to use that as a sort of example of where you have to double check everything. So last week when I did this, it said that whenever someone tries to transfer 10,000 euros, you need to have an additional screen to double check that they know what they're doing. That was an interpretation of something under the Consumer Protection Code in Ireland. It's not an actual requirement, and it's an interpretation that sort of doesn't really match what I think a reasonable person would expect. You can interrogate a lot of that stuff by just sort of actually interrogating it. So whenever there's something which it hasn't sort of substantiated why it's claiming something, you can just ask it, like, cite your sources. Why have you said this? And often you can sort of say, ask it, is that a direct requirement, or is that your interpretation of the requirements? And it's quite good when prompted in that way to sort of actually understand its own limitations and sort of say, no, this is me interpreting the requirements in a sort of more creative way than just sort of regurgitating something that's fact. I'll quickly move back to the slide deck. So a couple of tips. The AI will always sound confident. So it's really important to sort of like trust but verify. So it is right much more frequently than it's wrong. So it's not unreasonable to sort of take its provisional answer and to start working on the assumption that it's correct, but always verify. So go check its sources, go and convince yourself that that answer is right. But often it's much easier to convince yourself that it's right than it is to sort of come up with the right answer yourself. Like a really good example of this, actually, if I quickly switch back to the Notebook LM. Yeah, I've lost my prompt. Let me see if this one works. So one thing in the context of Ireland that we've kind of got used to is that often the law says something, and there's guidance docs that in some cases sort of somewhat disagree with the law, and they sort of almost more authoritative. So if this one comes back, it will give a good example. Yeah, I can't see it in here, but essentially the example I wanted to show was the law in Ireland requires, if someone has multiple savings accounts, it requires them to submit an exemption document per savings account, which is a bit silly when the exemption document is going to be identical for all of them, but it says one should be submitted per savings account. But there's actually a guidance document that says, acknowledges that that's silly and says, actually, if someone submits an exemption document and they hold multiple accounts and exactly the same name and all the requirements are the same, you can use that to exempt the other savings accounts. And that's a really good example where the AI, when asked that question, found both of those sources and sort of recognized that actually there's a conflict in those sources, and it says the law says this, but actually the more recent guidance document seems to disagree, where our compliance people actually didn't find the guidance document. They focused solely on the law and sort of confidently stated we needed a document between them, because AI is very good at going through lots of information very, very quickly. And then once you've got that answer from the AI, it's easy to fact check because you can easily say, oh, that's different to our expectation. Show me your source. And then you find, and it references the guidance document. You find that paragraph in the guidance document, and it's very clear once you found that source. We are out of time, so I'm going to stop there and hand back.
Thank you, Daniel. We are out of time, so there are one or two questions that have been raised on the chat function that Sam has been busy working in the background and has addressed. I think most of them have been addressed, other than perhaps the last two. But I'm going to suggest that we move straight on to the finishing poll and details of the next workshop. Sam.
Amazing, thank you. So yes, we have our next workshop, which is on the 14th of April. We're going to be looking at how to build AI agents for risk and compliance. But it'd be great to understand from you what exactly we should look at in this session. So there are a range of things we could touch on. For example, financial promotions review, policy gap analysis, horizon scanning. There's been a lot of chat today about how that works with AI, as well as AML investigations, KYC reviews. But if there's anything at all that might be interesting, then please do put it in the chat, or alternatively follow up with us on email. And again, I will share my emails in the chat once more. And back over to you, Tim.
Okay, so thank you for joining us for today's session. Thank you for contributing, for raising your questions and your thoughts and responding to the polls. It's helping us, of course, build that understanding and awareness and share that as it's developing. I'm excited to be part of this project with Zango. I think the work is vital. And I'm sure that you'll take the opportunity to join us for the next masterclass that the details have been shared. It takes place in 56 days' time in April. And I'm confident we'll build on the foundations that have already been established. So I would say thanks to Sam and Ashi, but I think really you've been hosting it, so I'm not sure that's quite right. But thanks to you, wherever you're joining us from, for being part of this conversation, and do take care wherever you are. Thank you.